And just like that, we have now made it to the final video. Sweet relief. And hopefully, it will be in this video where everything comes together in harmonious unison. And that is because today we are covering the last of the 3 types of sport. That being interactive sports. So what are interactive sports? Well, they are sports where athletes perform simultaneously, but they can also interact and influence their opponents' performances. The main sports in this category will be, of course, basketball, football, tennis, boxing. There's really an infinity of these types of sports. Now, interactive sports represent the largest and most popular sports on the planet, and partly this is because they are purpose-built for entertainment and excitement. Now, let me explain what I mean by this. If you've watched this series for any length of time, you'll know that a sport must have the following 3 characteristics to even be considered a sport. And that is skill, physical exertion, and competition. Now, each type of sport that we've covered defines itself by maximizing one of these 3 characteristics to the greatest possible extent. In the case of precision sports, well, they maximize skill. In the case of coactive sports, they maximize physical exertion. And as you have probably already guessed, interactive sports maximize competition. And this is the secret to their success, insofar as popularity and entertainment goes anyway. So, what I will endeavour to demonstrate in this video is that increasing the competitiveness of any sport from any category not only makes it a more popular and entertaining sport, but also a fundamentally better and superior sport. In this sense, if we were looking for the best sport in the world in objective terms, whatever that means, it would almost certainly come from this category. Now, this is obviously a bold statement and it needs to be backed up. So let's begin to break down this idea of competitive sports or interactive sports into its main characteristics and see what makes them so prolific. Now let's begin with its signature trait, which is interactivity, contact and influence over other players. Now this is the defining attribute of the category, because being able to interrupt or intervene in the performance of your opponents is the cornerstone of this sport, and it's completely inconceivable in the other categories. But we do, however, need to apply some nuance here, because we need to distinguish between contact and influence. Now, contact is a subcategory within the broader umbrella of influence and interaction. I'll give you an example. In tennis, players never actually touch each other physically, and yet, through the proper manipulation of the ball, they can cause their opponents to go flying across the court. It's almost like a form of witchcraft. Outright contact, however, is different, and it relates specifically to the direct physical connection between competing athletes. And contact needs to be measured as more of a gradient, with some sports being more permissive than others. A good example to illustrate this is football. So, in football, as much as people, and me included, complain about all the dives and all the fouls and all the stoppages, there is a very good reason why contact in football needs to be closely monitored and less permissive than, let's say, rugby. Because in football, the way that players move and the way that players interact with the ball is the same, by using their feet. Now, while football players are able to do some unbelievable things with their feet, moving the ball with the same appendage that they move themselves creates a situation where balance needs to be compromised in favour of ball control, and even moderate contact can easily destabilise a player and thus forcing him to forfeit the ball. If this isn't completely clear, compare this to rugby or lacrosse or handball. In this situation, players are using their hands, or a stick controlled with their hands, to navigate the ball, and then they use their feet to move their own bodies. So what they are essentially doing is they are distributing the roles over double the amount of extremities and allocating each responsibility to the most capable appendage. It's a lot easier to move a ball with your hands and move yourself with your feet than move a ball with your feet and yourself with your hands. that's ridiculous. So by doing this, they preserve the ability to more easily balance and keep their footing, and then with their upper body they can shield the ball and manipulate the ball more effectively, and therefore it's justifiable to allow a far greater amount of contact to be exerted upon them, because that's what it's going to take to recover the ball. So I guess in relative terms we could say that football and rugby have a similar amount of contact. So with that caveat made, let's now try and examine the purpose of contact and interaction. What is the utility behind it? It's very good, it's very remarkable that it exists, but what purpose does it serve? Well, the core utility behind interactivity is being able to punch above your weight and being able to beat people that are quote unquote better than you. You can outsmart them, you can get them out of their comfort zone, you can out-strategize them. There are a million things you can try, and every single encounter in an interactive sport can be feasibly won by either party. Now, this isn't the case for the other sports. If someone is faster than you, there is nothing you can really do to slow them down or make yourself faster. All you can really do is try your hardest, hope that they have a bad day, and otherwise surrender yourself to the consequences. Now, this is a central concept, and we will definitely come back to that later. But hopefully, this teaser has showed you exactly why interactive sports can be considered superior to precision and coactive sports. However, let's put a pin in that and go on to a second characteristic of interactive sports, and that is the harmonization between skill and physicality. Now, once again, for anyone who has watched the previous videos, you will know that skill and physicality have an antagonistic relationship with each other, meaning that by trying to maximize one, you minimize the other. And this makes precision and coactive sports very, very specialized and very polarized. Interactive sports, on the other hand, try to maximize competition, and competition is a separate attribute which doesn't have any conditional relationship with skill or physicality. Now, obviously, every sport has to feature skill and physicality to some extent, and so there will always be some kind of friction and compromise, but by placing the focus on maximizing competition, interactive sports become much more balanced and skill and physicality coexist far more peacefully. Okay, this is great, but how does it actually work in practice? Let's look at some specific examples. Let's look at rest and breaks. One of the key aspects of precision sports was to give ample rest time between attempts to ensure that athletes make a full physical recovery so they can express their maximum skill for each attempt in their competition. This is the exact opposite for coactive sports, where absolutely no recovery is allowed in an effort to maximize physical exertion, and this is only made possible through low-skill sports. Interactive sports then strike a balance, implementing either multiple short breaks, like in tennis, or a singular longer break, like in football, where athletes are able to recover enough to maintain a high level of skill expression, but not so much that physical exertion no longer becomes a concern. Now imagine for a second if there were no rounds in boxing. It was just one round until a winner's decided. Under these circumstances, both fighters would progressively get so exhausted that neither would be able to throw a punch, and they would just keep on hugging and coming together, and the fight would just become so slow and lethargic that it would be completely unwatchable. Equally, consider if there were 20-minute breaks between every round. And not only would this be soul-numbingly boring for the audience, but there also wouldn't be much action, because any damage caused in one round would be virtually obsolete by the time the next round started. And even from a psychological perspective, fighters would never really be able to get into the fight because they're constantly being taken out of it for an extended period of time. Once again, this would make the fight virtually unwatchable. Hopefully then, this point is clear. So let me now introduce you to a more sophisticated example of how interactive sports harmonize skill and physicality. And that is through the concept of margin of error. Now, because interactive sports allow other players to influence and obstruct your performance, and because progressive exhaustion may dull an athlete's skills, interactive sports usually have a margin of error when it comes to the most critical actions that are performed in a sport. Let's look at field hockey and golf, for instance. And this is a useful example because although the sports have really nothing to do with each other, they use a similar looking object, which might help to visually illustrate my point. Now, the objective of golf is you are trying to get a ball in a hole. You are stationary, you have a perfect customized club for the job, there is complete and utter silence, and you take virtually all the time you need to compose yourself and meticulously calculate the trajectory of your shot. Upon hearing this, it seems relatively reasonable, given how permissive the conditions are, that the hole you're trying to get your ball in be quite small, as this will then reward higher skill and technique, thereby fulfilling the purpose of a precision sport. And then with hockey, you are still trying to get the ball in a hole, albeit a vertical one, except here you are running at maximum speed. You've probably been running for the last half an hour. You see a brief opening, a fleeting window of opportunity. You have no time to think. You go to shoot, and immediately a flurry of opponent sticks try to block you. Once again, we can see that under these circumstances, and given how adverse the conditions are, it is also more reasonable to provide a much bigger target, even if it does have a goalie. But let's take this concept of margin of error and take it even further. And let's look at boxing, because actually boxing is quite interesting because it has a double margin of error. And where we find it is actually in the gloves. Now, having padded gloves allows for fighters to be able to make mistakes and be able to take more risks and be more aggressive, with the safety that if they don't completely pay off, the fight doesn't immediately end because they just wolf down a knuckle sandwich. Now, unlike the previous examples, this is almost like a negative margin of error. Instead of making it easier to do something in interactive sports, like easier to score a goal in hockey, it actually makes it harder to knock someone out. And this is actually a good example of interactive sports maximizing entertainment. Because as incredible as it was to see Conor McGregor knock out Aldo in 13 seconds, it was also, admittedly, a little bit anticlimactic. You had just sat down with your popcorn, hoping for an absolute slug war, and poof, suddenly, the fight is over. Now, once again, more padding on gloves encourages fights to go longer, while simultaneously encouraging fighters to be more aggressive, which is paradoxical if you think about it. Because logically, the more aggressive a fighter is, the quicker a knockout's going to come, and therefore the quicker the fight will end. But padding compromises between these and makes the event exponentially more entertaining. And here's where it gets really, really interesting, because the happy byproduct of this maximization of entertainment is that it simultaneously increases both skill and physical exertion. Physical exertion, obviously, because the fights go for longer, and it also maximizes skill because fighters take more risks and are willing to experiment with more advanced techniques. So in conclusion, we can see from this that by pursuing maximum competition and maximum entertainment, boxing and interactive sports as a whole inadvertently also find a way to increase both skill and physicality simultaneously without having to compromise between them. It is truly remarkable. The second way that boxing provides a margin of error through its gloves is by making the surface area of your fist exponentially larger. And so the effect that this has is, yes, it makes your punches not land as hard, which we've already discussed the utility behind this, but it also makes it easier to land punches because, well, you obviously have a larger fist. And so what this means is that when you are really tired and exhausted in the later rounds, you are less likely to miss, making skillful techniques more accessible through fatigue. And once again, this is a perfect example of how maximizing competition allows skill and physicality to coexist more peacefully. If we wanted boxing to be a precision sport and maximize skill, you would, I guess, ideally want no padding at all. So fighters couldn't afford to miss and had to be very accurate. And they could also demonstrate their full power without external limitations. I guess it would manifest a little bit like Dana White's new combat sport, like the slapping one, the slap chop or whatever it's called. Equally, if you wanted to make boxing a coactive sport, you would want as much padding as possible to avoid an early knockout, and you would presumably have just these massive pillows on your hand, and they would all be walloping at each other, and the winner would be the person with the most endurance. Either way, kind of misses the point of boxing. Beautiful. Right, let's move on to the last category of just interactive sports as a whole, and that is intransitivity. Now, this is where we revisit the previously teased point of athletes being able to beat superior athletes in interactive sports. Intransitivity is actually a term borrowed from game theory, and I'm not even sure it translates perfectly to my scenario, but I'm rolling with it anyway. So, precision and coactive sports are transitive games, and interactive sports are intransitive. Now, transitive games work as follows. If A beats B and B beats C, then A must also beat C. In sport terms, it would work as follows. If I can beat you in a race and you can beat him in a race, then that must mean that I can also beat him in a race. Make sense? Good. Right. What's unique here is that interactive sports don't adhere to this. They are intransitive. An example of an intransitive game is rock, paper, scissors. One would think, if it was transitive, that because rock beats scissors and scissors beats paper, that rock would also beat paper. But no, in fact, rock loses to paper. In sports terms, it might be something like this. If I beat you at boxing and you beat him at boxing, it doesn't necessarily mean that I can beat them in boxing. Or if we're talking about team sports, for example, it would be if Liverpool can beat Arsenal and Arsenal can beat Chelsea, it doesn't necessarily mean that Liverpool is going to beat Chelsea. Okay? And why is this? Well, if we go back to rock, paper, scissors, we find that it's because each object has certain attributes which behave as strengths or weaknesses when pitted against other objects with their own unique set of attributes. And so to elaborate on the sports example, in football, teams play under various different systems. You have very attacking teams, you have very defensive teams, but then you have teams that are very possession orientated, play for the counter, park the bus, prefer the right wing, the left wing, so many different variables. And so when these different styles compete against each other, results can be unpredictable. Sometimes, often even, a better team on paper may consistently lose to a supposedly far worse team because they really struggle against their particular playing style. Or the same teams may face each other multiple times within a few days or weeks and generate vastly different results. And so if you just look at the scores and don't try to understand the complexities behind the sport, it might seem very anarchical. For a precision or coactive sport, it would be like Bolt winning one race and then losing the next, and then being somewhere in the middle. You'd be like, is this guy the fastest man in the world or not? And therein lies the beauty of interactive sports. Because even if you are faced with a disfavourable encounter, if approached and executed with strategic and tactical superiority, there is always a way to win. And this cannot be said for coactive or precision sports. Like I said, if there are 8 sprinters lined up, the one who has the best, relatively recent PB must win. If he doesn't win, and the winning time isn't better than his PB, then he has categorically underperformed. The broader point to make here is that precision and coactive sports performances are objective in a way, because they are unspoiled by interference and interaction. We will never be able to know what prime Rafa Nadal versus prime Carlos Alcaraz would have been like, or prime Messi versus prime Maradona. But we can compare to the absolute millisecond what prime Usain Bolt is compared to prime Noah Lyles, and what prime Michael Phelps is compared to prime Leon Marchand. Right, so I'm sorry if that point was a bit more rambly, but it's a hard concept to explain, even if it's an easy one to wrap your head around. So I hope that you have, and that you now understand what sets interactive sports apart and what makes them so unique. But now for the final part of the video, we're going to move on from exploring interactive sports to scrutinizing the specific attribute of competition and seeing how it applies to different sports of every category and what specifically makes a sport high scoring in competition or low scoring in competition, regardless of it being precision, coactive, or interactive. The first key contributor to high competition worthy of consideration is proximity. And I mean proximity in the physical sense, not emotional or any other interpretation. Because physical proximity is a criminally underrated aspect about sports, and this applies to all three types. Now, I think we can all accept and understand that the only way to compete is to do so against other human beings. And so the closer those other human beings are to you while you're competing, the closer the competition is, and therefore the more intimately and intensely you feel it. In some sports like golf or diving or weightlifting or gymnastics, your opponents are often not even in view and can sometimes be many meters away. And so not having to look your opponents dead in the eyes, or not having to see them at all, greatly dilutes this sense of direct confrontation and competition. Now, the polar opposite of this takes place in combat sports. Your competition is directly in front of you. You can read their facial expressions, you can almost hear their thoughts, and their bodies are constantly clashing violently into yours. There is no illusion you can use to deceive yourself to hide the fact that you are in fierce and intense competition and there's someone trying to beat you to a pulp. So these being the two extremes set the landscape that all other sports then populate. For instance, let's look at tennis. Now, tennis is quite unique because I can't remember the exact tennis player. I think it was Zverev who said that although tennis is not a contact or a combat sport, you do feel the emotions and the aggressions of your opponent channeled through the ball. And this is really what makes tennis such a remarkable sport, because it's one of the sports that most closely resembles a combat sport without actually being one. In fact, I'm going to make a whole video on tennis because I think it might be a front runner for the best sport in the world, objectively speaking, for the individual category anyway. But anyway, the fact remains that tennis is neither a combat or a contact sport. In fact, players spend most of their time around 20 meters away from each other, and they are using the ball as a proxy for their interactions. And this adds, at least for me, a noticeable degree of separation between the two, and in some ways stifles this sense of competition. And actually, to prove my point, the moment that I feel the most tension in a tennis match is when players take a break and they actually have to cross each other at the net. It always feels a bit awkward and tense, especially after a disagreement. Why? Well, because these two people who have been fighting at a distance now have to come together face to face. So you see, proximity. And the same thing also applies to coactive sports. In running particularly, when you're lining up at the start line, I feel like everyone's sizing each other up and they're looking to subtly, perhaps even subconsciously, intimidate their opponents. And in the actual race itself, you are inches away from your opponents and sometimes even crash into them, rubbing elbows, hearing them pant, and you can almost feel their frustration if you pass them. But on the other hand, with rowing, you are meters away from each other and you are kind of facing backwards, and this gives a vastly reduced feeling of visual and physical proximity, which for me has a noticeable impact on the excitement of the competition. So physical proximity is one of the most contributory factors to a high competition sport. But let's look at another one now, and that would be the concept of pressure. Now initially I was going to divide pressure into two separate points, but I've joined them because they can both fit under this umbrella of pressure. Now, there is no doubt that the king of competition is interactive sports. But the more compelling question is, if that's the case, which category comes second? Is it coactive or is it precision? So the first parameter to determine pressure is overthinking. And one of the key aspects that separates the good athletes from the great, as probably everyone knows, is being able to keep their cool and keep their calm in moments where the stakes are the highest. And this can happen across all sports, but particularly for precision sports, this is a crucial challenge because the effect of uncontrollable nerves has a much more influential impact on high skill sports than high physicality sports, like coactive sports. If you are extremely nervous and you're going into the most important race of your life, it's a lot harder to mess up running. You can't really overthink running. It's just putting one foot in front of the other. And this doesn't mean you're going to perform at your best, and you could even jump the gun or stay frozen in extreme cases. But most of the time, when you hear the gun and the performance starts, then physical exertion begins to take over and your mind slowly clears. In the case of precision athletes, their event usually requires far more fine motor skills, and so extreme nerves can have a far more devastating effect on their performance. In fact, I think we can encapsulate the point I'm trying to make far better in the story of William Tell. And think about it for yourselves. If you were given the choice, would you rather A. shoot an apple off the head of the person you love most in this world with a bow, or B. set a strong PB in a random coactive sport? It could be anything: rowing, running, swimming, whatever. Now, it's not a super easy question, and it might vary from person to person, but I'm confident that the majority of the people would prefer to set a PB in a physical endeavour rather than stake the life of a loved one on a specific fine motor skill, regardless of how good you are at it. And ultimately, the core idea here is that it's far harder to execute a complicated skill, like shooting, when under extreme pressure, than an easy skill, like running. Okay, this seems fair enough. So I guess precision sports would be the second most competitive before coactive, right? Well, it isn't that easy, is it? It never is. Because we can look at pressure from a different perspective, and a whole different argument can be made. And in the words of one of the goats of his own world, coactive sports are usually
one shot, one opportunity.
And what this shows us is that in life there are seldom second chances. Returning to our William Tell analogy, he only had one shot, literally. This isn't usually the case for precision sports. Typically, athletes get multiple chances to execute the skill, and with this cushion, nerves can subside and ensure optimal performance. For coactive athletes, on the other hand, the second they cross the line, it's over, it's done. There are no do-overs or second chances. I guess this then fundamentally changes our analogy, and it would look something more like, would you rather have 10 opportunities to shoot an apple off your loved one's head, and no, they don't die if you hit their body? Or would you rather set a strong PB in a coactive sport, or your loved one dies, but you only have one opportunity to do it? And this, once again, becomes a lot trickier. 10 shots seems quite generous. It depends how far you are. If it's 70 meters, like Olympic archery, then whoever my most loved person is can say their goodbyes, because you could give me 100 chances, it's never going to happen. But if it was a reasonable distance, 10 seems quite generous, 5 might be a little more even, but even still, it's too tough to split them. Maybe there's an obvious answer, but I don't see it. And so when it comes to pressure, this is ultimately my disappointing conclusion. They are fairly even, and despite exerting pressure in different ways, they are too close to be separated and declare a singular winner. And so you might have seen this coming, but ultimately, for me, it comes down to proximity. And this might be my own internal bias, but I can't in good faith proclaim a sport where you hardly see your opponents and you don't even perform at the same time to be more competitive than a sport where you all compete together, side by side, until only one remains. Therefore, even though it is sport by sport, I would say that in general, coactive sports are superior competitively speaking to precision sports. And I'm open to being wrong about it, I truly am, because competition is more of an instinct than a science. And I can think of various other perspectives and priorities that one could take that would clearly suggest precision sports to be competitively superior. So before I leave, I wanted to put everything together over these 3 videos, or 4, depending how you look at it, and break down how we might score certain sports based on our findings. So let's start with, and I'll do this randomly, skateboarding. Okay, cool. I'm actually very glad we got skateboarding because I haven't really spoken about it. So let's break it down. So let's start with gathering some rudimentary understanding on the sport of skateboarding. And we're going to do sort of the Olympic version, okay? So skateboarding is a precision sport, so it's turn-based. It has 2 modalities, park and street. Now, park has very wavy terrain and it encourages high-flying complex skills. And park is meant to simulate an urban environment, and so it has a lot more awkward obstacles that athletes need to navigate. Okay, so that's like the overview. Now we can move on to the format. So park skateboarding, you do 3 45-second routines, and only your best one with the highest score counts. Street skateboarding, on the other hand, is 2 45-second routines, and then you also get 5 attempts to land a singular best isolated skill. So although the 2 modalities are slightly different, we can probably justify scoring them together. So let's begin the SPC score. First up, we have skill. And being a precision sport, obviously, this is where the event really shines. And I like to think about it in 2 ways. 1, how difficult is it for a normal person to do the simpler skills and techniques in the sport? And 2, how extreme are the hardest and most difficult skills in the sport? So if you took a random person off the street who had never really skated before, they would probably be able to ride it, as in balance on it at low speeds. But I think as soon as they had to propel themselves and steer, things get complicated very quickly. And they definitely couldn't do an ollie. I mean, I'm the coolest guy I know, and I can't do an ollie. So that should tell you everything. And then it doesn't really need to be said, but the best tricks they do are so complicated that ordinary people can't even conceive of their technical demands. In fact, I see some of these skills and think to myself, yeah, I could do that easily. And that's almost exactly how I know that this is completely beyond my realm of comprehension. So definitely top marks in the skill department. But finally, I will point out that skateboard has an external object, being the board, obviously. And this brings an added degree of skill, as every technique needs to be executed through the skateboard, which adds an extra degree of skill to master than just performing skills with your body. And this is why I'll give it an 8.5 to 9 for skill. I won't give it a 10 because I want to reserve maximum scores for sports like gymnastics. Let's move on now to physical. Now, as expected, this won't be its highest mark, admittedly, because the main method of propulsion for skateboard, at least at the Olympic level, is gravity, as athletes usually, as we like to say, drop in to the routine. And there might be some extra speed generated by the skater themselves, dotted around the performance, but all in all, I can't really see myself giving skateboarding more than a 3 for physicality. And this brings us to competition. Now, skateboarding is one of those sports that is determined by judges, which means it's interpreted subjectively as opposed to measured objectively. This is already a bad sign and doesn't bode well for the sport because although judges obviously have rigorous scoring guidelines and precise metrics for each skill, some of the things they are quoted to consider are difficulty, execution, originality, fluidity, variety, and speed. The issue here is that you can't have objective guidelines for originality and fluidity, so it's necessarily going to be very dependent on interpretation. This is obviously the same as all other judging sports, however I do believe that skateboarding falls victim to it more than, say, gymnastics or diving, which are far more established and solidified when it comes to measurable judging parameters. Also, skateboarding is a routine sport as opposed to a singular action sport, and this allows you to salvage small mistakes and can be considered more permissive. In spite of this, athletes still get multiple attempts to score a run, and to add on to this, your final score is your best run. So in a way, as long as you still have a remaining attempt, you can feel quite free to fail. All things considered, it might seem like skateboarding would get a low score, but there is one final factor I want to touch on before I give my final verdict. And this is a secret competition characteristic which I didn't mention earlier as a reward for people who stay till the end, and totally not because I forgot to mention it, and that is danger. Now, I think sports that require bravery and take courage to perform instantly score higher in competition. If you could get seriously hurt doing a sport, it takes a far greater amount of heart and willpower to go out there and give it your all, and especially take risks. You're not only fighting a competition, but you're also concerned for your own health and well-being. And to be fair, skateboarding is probably one of the better examples of this, and this should certainly be reflected in the competition score. So therefore, my final verdict for skateboarding SPC score would be skill, let's call it 8.5. Physicality, probably go down to a 3. And competition, probably a 4, 4.5. But to be clear, it would be a 2 without the danger element. Cool, so I know this video is getting a bit long, so if you're done with it, don't hesitate to go and do something more useful. I've said everything I had to say. But just to make sure that my reasoning is sound, let's do another sport. Alright, so I got weightlifting, but it was so close to wrestling, I'm going to pretend we got wrestling because it's an interactive sport, it fits with the video, and I think I've got a really controversial take, which will be perfect to end on. So let's begin. Now, let's first look at skill. Now, wrestling doesn't seem to have any particularly challenging moves, which takes years to refine. I think the average person could most likely perform a lot of them. Where the skill really lies in these kind of wrestling sports is in chokes and joint locks. How to see them, how to set them, how to execute them. However, it seems that wrestling is very much a sport where winning comes by overpowering your opponents. The idea, from what I understand, is to hold your opponent on their back for a certain number of seconds. I don't know. And bear in mind that this doesn't mean that I don't think wrestling is a complex sport with very demanding tactics and strategies. But this isn't reflected in skill. It's reflected in competition. The skill section is more about fine motor technical difficulty of the predominant actions in the sport. So I think an appropriate score would be probably a 3.5, 4. Next, let's look at physicality. Now, most people would expect this to be a dominant characteristic for wrestling, and to be clear, it is. I certainly believe the exhaustion that wrestling produces is second to very few. However, I can't give it a 10 because athletes do take breaks. And bear in mind, this is a good thing for the sport. So trust me, it's worth losing a point here. Admittedly, another point needs to be deducted because the intensity over time graph can be very inconsistent. Athletes might start the match feeling each other out and grabbing each other subtly, avoiding big risks. And there could also be a condition where they enter a bit of a stalemate on the floor and they just sort of lie on each other, taking some time to recover. And it also might be the case that the fight is over in 10 seconds or 30 seconds. And it admittedly shouldn't be penalized for this, but the fact remains that if someone runs 400 meters in 10 seconds, they still have to run all of those meters. So if wrestlers had to wrestle all of the rounds, regardless of points, and then count the final tally, like in football, for example, it wouldn't lose this point. So in total, I know this seems blasphemous, and this isn't my controversial take, so be ready. I give it probably a 7.5 for physicality, maybe an 8. Okay, so finally let's look at competition, and here comes my controversial take. So on paper it's an immediate 10, right? Extremely physical, loads of proximity. It's not only a contact but also a combat sport, which is even more competitive. There's an element of danger. You're not throwing punches or choking or whatever, but there's still an element of danger. It's a singular fight for the win. It's tactical, it's strategic. It ticks all the boxes, really, to be a 10 in competition. But we have to consider that there are weight classes. Oh dear, here we go. Right. I'm going to make this quick because I'm considering actually doing a whole video on the concept of weight classes. But just think about it, right? Why are there weight classes in wrestling? What is the purpose? What is the utility? Because if there weren't, it wouldn't be fair for lighter athletes to go up against heavier ones. I mean, what is this utter woke nonsense? So you're saying that it isn't fair because the bigger athlete would win 100% of the time. Okay, and so what would be another way to say that it isn't fair? It wouldn't be competitive. Now, I'm judging the sport of wrestling as a whole, not individual matches. So imagine how basketball feels not being able to have height classes, or tennis not being able to have height classes. What about gymnastics? There are so many men and women who would absolutely love to do gymnastics, but they're just too tall or thick-boned. And so why is it that they can't participate? Well, because they wouldn't be competitive. And yet, somehow, combat sports get a pass. Well, not on my watch. Listen, if your sport isn't competitive without having to segregate people across physiological categories, then you are categorically not going to score very highly in my competition parameter. It's that simple. And I know that there are weight classes in combat sports because you need to preserve the health and well-being of the athlete. And a lighter athlete going against a heavier athlete would get absolutely pummeled. Whereas a heavier gymnast or a bigger gymnast going up against a lighter one, they'll just lose. But still, it doesn't change anything. So I accept this as a controversial take, and it's with a heavy heart that I leave you with the SBC score for wrestling. I give it probably a 5 for skill, maybe a 7.5 for physicality, and to be honest, no more than a 6.5 for competition.